Welcome back to another FSE tutorial. I am Jose Zamora with the Makino Mason training team. In this video, we will complete a Phoenix router orientation. When networking machines into customer networks, it is important to understand the different screens and settings needed to get a proper connection. After completing this video, you will feel more comfortable logging into the machine router and setting up an external connection. Let's get started. Alright, so let's begin with how to access the router itself. In the support menu on the Pro 6, go ahead and go to Toolbox, and you're going to select Router. Should be towards the bottom. When you select Router, you're going to have a pop-up window. Go ahead and acknowledge it, and it's going to prompt you for a username and password. So the username is admin, and the password is capital PRO, Pro. Once you input those two values, you hit login and it's going to take you to the main screen of the router itself. The router has multiple pages where you can change all types of configurations. We're going to focus on the configurations that we need to change in order to get the router connected to the customer's network. So from what we know about routers, we know that routers connect other networks to other networks. They connect separate networks together. If you want to know a little bit more about routers, just use the link below. It'll kind of describe what routers are for and how they function, but we're not really going to get into that right now. So the router on the machine connects the internal network of the machine to the customer's network. Now, the cool thing about the machine router is we only expose the devices that we want to. All right. So in the Phoenix Contact Router, there are two interfaces: the internal interface and the external interface. So the internal interface of the router communicates with all the devices on the machine, such as the chiller, the BTS, the magazine, FANUC side, panel I. The external interface of the router communicates with the customer's network. So, like I previously mentioned, we only expose the devices that we need to expose. So let's say we want the panel I to communicate externally to a device on the customer's network. So we can actually choose to only expose the panel I to the external network. So in this page that you see in front of you, we are in the interfaces page. Here is where we manage the interfaces. So internally, if you have a machine that you're installing, the internal network information should already be there. So the internal network, in this case, we have an IP address of 192.168.1.241. That is a standard address that Makino uses for the Phoenix Contact Router, and a net mask of 22255. So that should already be populated in there for you if you are installing a machine. If you are retrofitting a machine with the router, you actually have to manually input the internal network information. So how would you even know what IP address to put in there? There's actually a master list that you can reference that is linked in the description below, and that master list will give you the IP address that would be assigned to the Phoenix Contact Router. So that information, if you're installing a machine, it's already there. The information we actually need from the customer is the external network information. This is what their IT department is going to give you to assign that IP address. So this IP address is what the router uses on their network. So this is the IP address that when a file comes to the machine or the machine is communicating out to the customer's network, that IP address is assigned to the router. So when the customer's router gateway is trying to find the machine, it's going to use that IP address to gain access to it. And they're going to give you the subnet mask as well. So that subnet mask, it really varies depending on the customer. It could either be 22255.0, which is pretty common, or it could be a variable type mask. It just depends what type of network the customer has. The other important IP address that you need from the customer is the customer's default gateway. If you remember from networking training, the default gateway is a router. So the Phoenix contact router on the machine will need a default gateway on the customer's network. So the default gateway that you will be placing under external network will be the customer's default gateway. So those 3 IP addresses, you got the IP address for the router that will be used for the external interface. You have the subnet mask that will be used on the external network as well, and the default gateway. So those 3 IP addresses are what we need in order to have the router communicate with the external network, or also known as a customer's network. Without these 3 pieces of information, the machine router will not communicate out into the customer's network. Now, it's important to know that just because you put these 3 pieces of information or IP addresses does not mean the internal devices of the machine will communicate out into the network. The only device that is communicating at this point when you input these IP addresses is the router itself. The management of the internal devices of the machine and how they communicate to the outer network is managed in a different page, which we'll talk about here in a minute. Another thing that's important on this interface page is the network mode. Anytime we network a machine into a customer network, we always want the customer to assign the IP addresses as a static type network. It's very rare when we set up machines as DHCP. DHCP, if you remember from networking training, is when the machine gets auto-assigned an IP address. So standard is a static type IP address. So within the interface page under network mode, you want to confirm that the network mode is router and router mode is static. By static, we are manually assigning that IP address in the external networks page, which is where we're at right now. Next, let's move on to the NAT table. NAT stands for Network Address Translation. So this page is where we manage what devices are going to communicate to external devices on the customer's network. Now, remember, the router separates the internal machine network from the customer's external network. So you'll find a few different columns with various types of IP addresses. So let's start on the left where it says local network. So in this column are the IP addresses for devices internally in the machine. So if you look at the way at the right, you got under comment, you got panel I, you got Vision BTS, you got ACU, you have FHU, chiller, and then the NC side. All right. So in the local network column, those IP addresses are only used internally within the machine. So when we're talking about connecting devices externally to the customer's network, it's only necessary to expose the devices we would like to. So in this particular scenario that we have right now, I actually exposed all the devices into it's not a customer, it's at the integration bay, but the purpose behind it is I wanted to show my class how we can do that. So we're going to talk about how you expose those IP addresses. So the local network column is the actual IP address of each device internally within the machine. Now, when we're talking about the external network column, this is where the IT department on the customer side is going to give you an additional IP address to assign to any particular component within the machine. So let's say I'm installing a machine and I only want the panel I, which is the control, communicating out to the customer's network to transfer programs and whatnot. So I need an IP address from the customer in order to assign that external IP address to the panel I. So the mechanics behind that is the router itself, it's going to receive that request from the external interface. The external interface being maybe another server or another PC on the customer's network. Their PC is going to be looking for that external IP address. So they're not going to know the internal IP address of that device because it has no clue. It's just going to look for that IP address that the IT department gave you. So once that IP address comes to the router and says, hey, I'm looking for this particular IP address, the machine router will look at that IP address and reference the NAT table and say, all right, so I have an IP address of 172.24.192.242. I'm going to look at my chart. Oh, that's the panel I. So I'm going to forward this information request to the panel I. So as you can see, that the router is doing the routing of information. So externally, we need an external IP address in order to expose that particular device. So if there is no IP address in the external network column, then that particular device will not be translated over to the external network. All right. So when you want devices internally on the machine to communicate with the external network, you must have an external network IP address within that column. If it is left blank, it will not communicate to the outside network. So remember, local network is the internal IP address of the devices. External network is the IP address assigned by their IT department for that particular device. The net mask will always be 32, and enabling ARP, the default is yes, and then comment, that you can actually manually fill in. If you are installing a brand new machine, some machines come with the NAT table completely empty. You may see some machines that have only the panel I. So you can actually populate this table by clicking on the arrow to add an additional device. So a good rule of thumb that I like to recommend is when you're installing a machine, go ahead and add all the devices in the machine into the NAT table. Now, that doesn't mean just because you add the device, it's going to translate over. Remember, you have to have an external network address. So if you leave the external network address blank, 0.0.0.0, and just put the local network address, it's a very good reference table when somebody else comes in after you and sees, all right, what IP addresses are on this machine. So it's a good reference to go in there and do that. Next, let's move on to the DNS server page. In this page, DNS is not necessary to gain a connection to the customer's network, but if the customer wants you to assign a DNS server to the router, you can do it in the DNS page. Again, DNS IP address is not required in order to gain a connection to the customer's network. Now, if you remember from networking training, the purpose of a DNS server is to take an address that is in word form and change it into an IP address. So it's the translator from words to IP addresses. Next, let's talk about troubleshooting with the router. There will be instances where there is no connection between the customer's network and the router. So you can either ping from the customer's network, or typically people ping from internally in the machine to the router to see if the router is working. But my personal preference is to use the router. And the reason I say that is because the router can access both interfaces, the external network and the internal network. So within the support page under tools, you have a couple of things you can do to troubleshoot a connection. You have the ping function, so you can actually ping IP addresses on the internal interface and the external interface. And then you have traceroute. Traceroute allows you, as you know from networking training, allows you to see the routers, the amount of hops from the router of the machine to the router in the customer's network. Anytime you have the panel I not communicating with the customer's network and you've set your IP addresses in the NAT table, this is my go-to when it comes to troubleshooting connection. Remember, when you don't have a connection between two devices, the easiest way to check is to ping the device itself. So using the router as that tool to ping internally and externally will help you solve the issue, whether it's an internal network within the machine problem or an external network within, external network meaning out in the customer's network. Now, when you do ping from the router, internally, the majority of the time, everything works. The problem that comes when you don't have a connection is the NAT table. The NAT table settings may be incorrect, or the router itself is not configured, which we'll talk about here in a minute. So now let's talk about troubleshooting the connection between the customer's network and the internal devices of the machine. So let's say you populated the NAT table with the IP addresses that their IT department gave you, and there's still no communication between devices. So your first go-to, like we talked about, is going to go to the tools page and ping from the router itself. So let's say you ping internally, that works just fine. Let's say you ping externally, and that works as well. So what is going on? So more often than not, what happens is the router is not configured. So in order to configure the router, we have to upload a configuration file. So let's talk about how to access that file and how to upload it. So now we're on my laptop. In order to access the file, you need to go to Makinonet, and then under customer support, you're going to go to the training page. So it should be on the left side. Click on training, and then we're looking for machine networking docs, which should be under the technical training links. So go ahead and click on that, and it's going to bring you to a file share. Click on the networking class folder, the networking resources, and we're looking for Pro6 networking. Once you click on that, you're going to look for the file that's titled Pro6 router install and configuration. So we're going to open that file. Once the file is open, the configuration file that we need is within the Word document. So if you scroll further down the document, you'll notice a zip file. Once that zip file is found, you're going to go ahead and open it. You're going to extract it, and then you're going to save it to a USB drive. Now, there's a couple ways you can go about in uploading this configuration file. My preferred method is to connect my laptop to the router and then configure my laptop settings so I can remotely log into the router using my laptop screen. It makes it easier for me, and it's a lot better to input IP addresses and upload files. So this file upload, this file that we put on the USB, or if you're logging in through your laptop, you can just keep that file within your laptop and then do it remotely. If you want to know how to log in remotely to your router, just look at the link below. The video will tell you how to do that. So we talked about the NAT table and all the other configurations being correct, but we're still not having a communication between the customer's network and an internal device. And like I previously mentioned, more often than not, it's the configuration file that has not been uploaded to the router itself. So once you're in the laptop, and once you have the laptop connected to the router, or if you're doing it via the control, you're going to upload that configuration file to the configuration profiles page within the router. So as you can see here under the browse section, you're going to hit browse, and then you're going to upload that file that you got from the document. Once you upload that file, you just click on the upload, and it's going to configure the router. Now, you will need to reset the router, power the router down, and then boot it back up. All right, and that's going to set the router configuration. Once you do that, your connections between the external network and the internal network will be solved. Let's review on all the different settings that we need to apply in order to gain a communication between the customer's network and the internal network of the machine. So let's talk about the internal and external interfaces. The internal interface, as we talked about, is for the internal network of the machine. So we're talking about the BTS, the magazine, the chiller, FANUC side, panel I. All right, that's a network within itself. All right, that's the internal interface. If you are installing a machine, that internal interface on the router, that page already has that information populated. If you are retrofitting a router to a machine, you have to input that information, that IP address, that subnet mask manually. And you would reference the IP address master list in order to do that. So if you are installing a machine with the router already configured on it, you don't have to worry about the internal interface. The one you do have to worry about is the external interface. The external interface is for the customer side. So the external interface will require an IP address, a subnet mask, and a default gateway. Those three pieces of information are provided by the customer's IT department. So that's what you're going to manually input into the external interface section of the router. Once you've input those interfaces, the internal, the external, then you have to manage the NAT table, the Network Address Translation Table. Remember, this is where we allow access to devices from the outside network. So we have the internal network IP addresses. Those are for the internal network of the machine. And then you have external network. So any device that you want to communicate to the outside network, you have to assign an external network IP address. So let's say you're trying to get the panel I to communicate to the customer's network. You have to assign an external IP address to the panel I. All right. When you do that, you will have communication between the outside and the internal network of the machine just for that particular device. Now, if you have done all your settings, you assign all the IP addresses, and you still are having issues, then we have to look at the configuration file that we'll talk about here in a second. Next is the DNS information. If the customer has a DNS server that they want you to put in there, you can. It is not necessary in order to gain access to the customer's network, but if they do have one, you want to place DNS information in the router's DNS page. Troubleshooting. Now, we talked about the NAT table and the issues that you can run in with the NAT table. One of those issues being that the internal device is not communicating with the outside network. So first things first, you obviously want to check your internal, external interfaces, making sure those are correct. You want to verify your NAT table and make sure you have an external IP address for that device you're trying to get out to the network. If all those settings are correct, then we have to go in the router and use a tools section where you can ping from, and you're going to ping the external network and the internal network. If that is functioning correctly, chances are that the configuration file has not been uploaded to the router. So you can upload that configuration file either by logging in remotely to the router with your laptop or via USB. All right, so this concludes the video on how to configure the Phoenix router in the machine. If in the future or at any point you need additional help, feel free to reach out to me. I'm available by phone, chat on Teams, or you can just send me an email. If you can't get a hold of me, just call the hotline as you know. Other than that, have a great day, guys.